Okay, so have you heard about this whole thing with Trump and Biden and presidential pardons?
Hmm.
It's kind of crazy how something so old school like presidential power is clashing with tech stuff these days. We're talking signatures and whether they're valid or not.
It really makes you think about how we define an official act in the digital age, doesn't it? The lines can get blurry.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. So Trump recently made a pretty bold claim. He's saying those preemptive pardons President Biden gave to everyone on the January 6th committee, totally invalid.
Invalid, huh? That's a strong word. What's the basis for that claim?
Well, according to a CBS News report we've got here, Trump's argument boils down to one thing: the Autopen. He's basically alleging that because an Autopen was potentially used to sign these pardons, they're null and void. No force or effect, he says.
An Autopen, you say? For those of us not up on our presidential signing tech, what exactly are we talking about here?
It's a gadget, really. Think of it like a fancy machine that can perfectly copy someone's handwritten signature. Seems old-fashioned, but it's actually pretty relevant in this situation. So for everyone listening, today's deep dive is all about untangling this mess. What is an auto pen? How much power does the president really have when it comes to pardons? And does Trump's argument actually hold any water legally?
Lots to unpack there. It's a fascinating intersection of presidential power, technology, and some ongoing political tension.
So let's jump right in, shall we? Trump took to his platform, Truth Social, to make this declaration. He posts, "These pardons are void, vacant, and of no further force of effect because of the fact that they were done by Autopen." Pretty straightforward, right?
Direct and to the point. And based on the CBS report, it looks like he goes even further.
Oh yeah, he doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He actually claims, and I want to emphasize here, the report notes that he hasn't provided any evidence to support this, that Biden didn't even sign those pardons himself.
So he's implying that Biden wasn't even involved in the decision.
Pretty much. He goes on to say that Biden did not know anything about them. Basically, he's painting this picture where the pardons were issued without the president's actual knowledge or consent, making them, in his view, totally illegitimate.
And the use of the Autopin is central to this narrative, it seems.
Exactly. He's really hammering on that point.
Yeah.
And, this isn't just some random comment from Trump. It's kind of part of a pattern we've been seeing.
Now that you mention it, it does seem to fit with a lot of his past statements regarding the January 6th investigation. He's been pretty critical of the committee and its work.
Yeah, think back to some of the things he said before. He's accused the committee of destroying evidence, called the investigation a major crime, even said that everybody on the committee should go to jail.
Those are some pretty strong statements, not just criticizing the committee's findings, but actually suggesting criminal wrongdoing on their part.
Right. And it wasn't just talk. Remember last July when he took to social media and accused Liz Cheney, one of the committee members, of treason? He even suggested that they should have televised military tribunals. That's not exactly subtle.
So this latest statement about the autopins and the pardons being invalid, well, it kind of feels like another piece in that puzzle, wouldn't you say?
I think so, yeah. Like he's setting the stage for something, maybe hinting that if he were back in office, his administration might actually go after those committee members. It's definitely a little unnerving to think about.
It's certainly adding another layer of complexity to this whole situation. What might have seemed like a procedural detail about how documents are signed suddenly becomes a lot more politically charged when you consider the broader context.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Autopen, but let's step back for a minute. I'm sure a lot of people listening are wondering, what exactly is this thing?
It's not something you hear about every day, but the CBS News report actually gives a pretty clear explanation. It's basically a machine, right? A device that can mechanically reproduce a handwritten signature. It's designed to perfectly replicate the look and feel of an actual signature.
So you're saying presidents have been using this thing for ages?
It's not a new invention, that's for sure. The article mentions that the patent for the autopin goes all the way back to the early 1800s. Think about that. Even Thomas Jefferson might have used one.
Wow, that really puts things into perspective. It's not some shady new tech they're using.
Not at all. It's been around for a while. The report points out that President Harry Truman was the first to officially adopt an autopin for presidential duties, and John F. Kennedy apparently used one pretty frequently too.
Oh, Kennedy. That's interesting. So not just any presidents, but some pretty big names.
Exactly. And more recently, even President Obama used an autopin back in 2011 to sign an extension of the Patriot Act. And he did this while he was in France. So there's definitely precedent for using this technology, even for signing significant legislation.
Okay, so we see that presidents have used this Autopen thing for quite a while, even for important stuff like signing laws. But the question is it actually legal to use it for these official acts? Like, does it hold up in court?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And thankfully, CBS News points us to a pretty important piece of legal interpretation. Back in 2005, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, the folks who advise the president on legal matters, issued an opinion specifically addressing this issue. They looked into whether using an autopin to sign legislation was kosher.
So they basically said yay or nay on using this thing for signing bills into law.
Their opinion was pretty clear. They concluded that a president doesn't actually have to physically hold a pen and sign a bill for it to become law. They emphasized the president's intent and direction as being the key factors.
So it's about the president's say-so, not the actual mechanics of the signature.
Right, and the article even quotes the then Deputy Assistant Attorney General Howard Nielsen Jr. He said, and I quote, "The president may sign a bill within the meaning of Article 1, Section 7, by directing a subordinate to affix the president's signature to such a bill, for example, by Autopen." So it seems like a president can delegate the actual signing as long as they've given the order.
So for laws, it seems pretty settled then. A president can use an Autopen, and it's all good legally speaking. But what about pardons? Is it the same deal?
That's where things get a little tricky. The power of pardon is a pretty unique one. The Constitution gives the president almost unlimited authority when it comes to granting clemency, and there aren't many restrictions on how they do it.
Few limits, huh? That's interesting. So is there anything that tells us how a pardon should be given, like what form it needs to take?
Well, this is where that CBS report really shines. They bring up a recent court ruling that directly tackles this question of whether a pardon needs to be issued in writing.
Interesting. What did the court say? Did they come down on one side or the other?
In 2024, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit issued a pretty significant ruling. It was unanimous, too, so all the judges agreed. They found that, get this, pardons or commutations don't actually have to be given in writing to be legally valid.
Hold on. So a president could, verbally pardon someone, and it would hold up in court. That seems wild.
That's the implication, yeah. The court was very clear in its statement. They said, and I'm quoting directly here, "Nothing in the Constitution restricts the president's exercise of the clemency power to commutations that have been rendered through a documented writing." Basically, they're saying the president's decision to pardon someone is what matters, not necessarily whether there's a piece of paper to prove it.
Wow. That's a pretty big deal. So even though we typically think of a pardon as this formal document with fancy language and a seal.
Right, exactly. It's the classic image, isn't it? But the court clarified that it's not about the document itself. They said, a clemency warrant, or indeed any writing, is not required for the president to exercise this authority under the Constitution. The focus is really on the president's intent to grant clemency, not the form it takes.
This is fascinating. So technically, a verbal pardon could work, but the article does mention a real-life example that kind of highlights the complications of all this. A case with a guy named James Rosemond. What happened there?
Ah, yes, the Rosemond case. It kind of shows the practical side of things, even with this court ruling. Rosemond was serving life sentences, and he claimed that during a phone call, President Trump had verbally told two of his supporters that his sentence was commuted.
So like a casual, hey, you're pardoned kind of thing.
Something like that. But despite this claim, Rosemond never got an official written pardon warrant. His petition was still listed as pending even after Trump left office.
So even though the court said a written pardon isn't absolutely necessary, the lack of one in this case basically left Rosemond in limbo.
Exactly. It shows that while the Constitution might not require a written document, having one really does make a difference in practice. It makes it a lot easier to prove that a pardon was actually granted. And the fact that this ruling came from a panel of judges appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents kind of shows that this isn't a partisan issue. It's a pretty solid legal interpretation.
That's a great point. So we've established a couple of things. First, when it comes to laws, using an autopen is legally sound. And second, a pardon doesn't technically need to be written, though it usually is. So now let's circle back to those Biden pardons for the January 6th committee members. Who exactly did those pardons cover?
Let's see. The CBS report confirms that those full and unconditional pardons, as they were called, applied to all the members of the House January 6th Select Committee, anyone on their staff who helped with the investigation, and any officers from the D.C. Metropolitan Police or the U.S. Capitol Police who testified before the committee. It was a pretty wide-ranging pardon, covering a lot of people involved.
And these were signed right before Biden left office.
That's right. They were signed on January 19th, just one day before his term ended.
And if I remember correctly, he didn't just pardon those folks, right? Didn't he issue a bunch of preemptive pardons on his way out?
Absolutely. He granted a few other preemptive pardons, including some high-profile ones for Dr. Anthony Fauci, retired General Mark Milley, and even some members of his own family.
So to sum up, we've got Trump saying Biden's pardons aren't valid because they were maybe signed with an Autopen. But looking at what we've discussed, legally speaking, it doesn't seem like he has much of a case. The Justice Department says Autopens are okay for laws, and a federal court has ruled that pardons don't even need to be written down.
That's the gist of it, yeah. Trump's argument is focusing on a technicality that doesn't seem to have strong legal ground. But I think it's also important to remember the context surrounding all of this.
Totally. As we talked about earlier, Trump seems to be laser focused on the January 6th committee, and he's kind of hinted at going after them if he gets the chance. This whole Autopen argument, whether it holds legal weight or not, definitely keeps the issue in the spotlight.
And that raises a really interesting question, doesn't it? With technology constantly evolving and the way we interpret the law sometimes struggling to keep up, what other areas of presidential power could be questioned in the future? Could we see similar challenges popping up based on how presidents use technology in their official duties? It's definitely food for thought as we navigate this increasingly digital world.
Absolutely. It's a conversation that's just beginning, and it'll be fascinating to see how it unfolds. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive. It was a wild one.
It was a pleasure. Until next time.
Yeah.